have Heather Kossila here with Kraus-Anderson. She has been a profiler user for a few years now and currently at her company about a year and a half. She has some interesting techniques that most people probably wouldn't think of how to use, how to deal with variables in estimates. And with that, Heather, I'll go ahead and let you take it away.
Thanks, Holly. Hi, everyone. As Holly said, my name is Heather Kossila. I have about 20 years experience in the design and construction industry. My background is actually in architecture, and I'm also an instructor at the University of Minnesota. So today, what we're going to talk about is just maybe another way to use Profiler and to use variables within Profiler. And I'll just give you a little background on why we're doing this and what the need is for this here at Kraus-Anderson. So like a lot of you, we wanted to build a database that mimicked our database for cost history, which here at Kraus-Anderson we use something called model logics. And so we took some of the line items from our, from model logics and determined which ones would be useful for a conceptual estimate, and we ended up with 469 line items, and we have 5 work breakdown structures for every line item, so we can sort things and group things by those different work scopes in their system, and then just work scope for the trades, viewpoint code, which is our accounting software, uniformat, master format, and CSI. So actually, I'm wrong. There's actually 6. So that's kind of where we started, and started building in formulas that were dependent on a lot of variables. So we have 214 variables that are used in these formulas here for the line items, and we also have created some formulas that are then in the formulas. So we have 214 variables and 31 formulas, and that's all. I don't know what everybody else has, but that's a lot of variables to have to be changing every time you start a new building. And a lot of our variables, if you look at them here, a lot of them are things that will change depending on the type of building it is. So we have variables in here, for example, countertop stone percent. Well, if it's a factory building, that's going to be pretty low compared to something like an office or a hotel. So we started thinking that this default value for the variables, while it's really nice, it's really not very handy if you have 214 of these that might need to get changed depending on your building type. So we thought, well, maybe we can create some formulas that will determine that for us. And so this is just an example of, saying if you have a different building classification, that something is going to change in this formula. And we could do that, but then if you create formulas for all of these things, then you lose the ability to go in here and manually change them if you need to. So you could say, for example, with that countertop stone percentage, you could say, if your building type is, say, a business building type, I want you to calculate, 10% for stone countertop. But if you're a hazardous building or a factory, I want it to be, 0%. And you could put that in a formula, but then once you put it in a formula in the database, you can't manually go in here and change it. So if you happen to know it's something different, there's no ability to change that. So then we thought maybe there's a way that we could assign a default variable for each of these building types. Right now we have 10 building types. They're based on the International Building Code, so it's very simple. It's not real complex. And if you have a building type that fits into one of these 10 buildings, the idea is that you would pick this, and then all of these default values would change depending on that type of building. And since Profiler doesn't have they only have one default value. You can't actually assign globally. You can't assign a default value for different building types. We thought maybe there's another way we could do this, and so that way that we came up with is by creating a batch file. So we have a batch file that instead of launching Profiler, you launch this batch file, and it asks the user to select your building type. It's actually a building classification, but it asks you to select your building type, and they have, out of the 10 building types that we've identified, they basically type in the letter, and then it will launch Profiler, and it has been told in the batch file to set all of these variables right here that you see, that which we have 214 of, to these values, depending on which building type it is. So I'm going to show you this in a minute. So I'm just going to go through the workflow here a little bit, and then I'll get right into showing you how it works and what it looks like. So essentially, you run a batch file. The user will select which type of building is best fitted to the building they're going to build, and then Profiler is launched. So here's the workflow. Like I said, select your building. And then Profiler is launched. You select your template, and if you haven't created a template, I highly recommend you do for your company. And it'll set things in there for you, such as different materials for cladding and whatnot. And then you select your building type. This is the Profiler building type, not the building classification. And we actually have only two building types. We have a built-out and a core and shell. So you first select your building classification, and then you tell Profiler, is this built out or a core and shell? And you select one or the other, and then it will assign some quantities and line items based on what you've picked. Then you hit finish, and you start modeling. So that's really it. And then you save it, and you move on like you normally would. I'm going to go into this in just a minute and show you how it works and show you what it looks like when you're doing this. But before I do that, I'm just going to mention there are a couple of things that I found that are obstacles that you have to watch out for in this workflow, and that is, so let's say you've gone through, you've selected your building type, you model you create your model, and it's adding cost to it as you're creating it. If you decide you need to add line items from your database later on that aren't in that building type or some new line item or something, the global variable value will vary. So here's an example I'm just showing you right here. If you go to your modify user-defined variables, these should be set to some value. And if you add a line item from the database that the value is different, then it will only change the value in that line item, and it won't change it globally. So that you'll end up with something that looks like this. So it can be a little difficult to manage. You have to be careful of that. Might be a good idea to check the user-defined variables after you've loaded in a new line item if you do that. Also, when updating costs, so this is if you go to, you want to update the cost but not reconnect to the database, make sure you do not update user-defined variables or values. Otherwise, they'll get completely reset to whatever the default is in Profiler in your database, which is not what you want. And then third, if you are running the batch file on an existing project, it won't change any of your default variables in that project. It just will launch Profiler as usual, and you'll still have all of the variables. So you can't use this to change your building that you've built to another building type or to globally change your variable values. So I think it's going to be a little easier to just show you this. And so I'm gonna run it for you real quick. Before I do that, I'm just going to show you, this is the Excel file with all of our variables in it. And these are the 10 different building types, which is in itself a variable. It's called building classification. And you can see that if it's assembly, it's going to be turned to a 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth. And then these are the values we've determined. And like I said, a lot of these are things that would definitely change depending on the type of building it is. I'm going to give you an example of building a business building and a hazard building, and the reason I picked these two is because there are so many values that are very different. They're very different types of buildings. And I'm just going to model something very simple, 100 by 100, square foot building. Okay? So here's my Profiler batch file. I've just created a shortcut here. So instead of launching Profiler by itself, I'm going to run this. And here's my dialog box, and it says, choose your building classification. I have my 10 classifications that I can pick from, and like I said, let me make sure I remember what I said. I'm going to pick business, so I'm type a B. It gives me 10 seconds to change my mind. If I want, I can just hit Control-C to quit. Otherwise, it's going to actually launch Profiler. And then I will go through the process of starting a new project. So here's Profiler, and I'm going to start a new project. I'm just going to go to File, New, and make sure that I select my template, pick OK. And then down here, these are those two building types that I mentioned. I'm just going to pick built out for now. If I pick core and shell, a lot of the interior collections are left out of that one, so it is just basically building, a shell. And then I'm going to pick finish, and I will have a blank screen like I'm starting a whole new project. So if I go here and go to modify user-defined variables, you'll see that there's nothing here, and that's because I haven't actually modeled anything yet. So I'm going to just create a mask. Like I said, I'll just do 100 by 100, something simple that I can compare easily. I'll do a 20-foot high, and then I'm just going to give it some grid lines really quick so that I can have it. I'm just going to give it a floor and a roof. Okay, so there's my basic building, 100 by 100, 10,000 square feet, pretty simple. Now when I go to user-defined variables, you'll see that a bunch of them are here because as I built my mass and added some structure, some slabs, it starts to quantify things based on the fact that I picked that built-out building type. So if I go look at, for example, building classification, you can see the values set to 2, which is the business one. That's the one that I selected. And just to give you an idea, let's see if I can, I'm just going to show you a couple of variables that I know are going to be very different between business and hazard. So we'll pick lockers, and you'll see that they're set to 4,000, which should be, that's what it should be set at. And then we have a lot of options as part of our database. Things that we just are lump sum items we turn on or off. We give them a quantity. Some of them we know won't exist. Like, this is an easy one, artwork. Well, there probably isn't going to be a line item for artwork in this hazardous building. So we're not even going to, so it would be turned off. But in a business building, there will be some amount of money left aside for artwork. So just go to some of those options. Let's see. So you see that's turned to 1 because I picked this building type here. I think that's all. I'm just going to show you those real quick. So that's my building type. If I go to look at my tabular view, and maybe I'll go to massings, and I'll pick artwork, you'll see that it's just turned to 1, and the lump sum, the cost is just at 1 cent right now because we haven't determined what that would be, but it is turned on. Okay, so that's just a real quick example. I'm going to just run the same thing now, but I'm going to pick hazard for my building type. So here I am. I'm running the batch file, and hazard is H. So I just type in H. It does the same thing. It's going to give me a little bit of time to change my mind. I'm not going to change my mind, so we're just going to keep going. Okay, and I'm going to select new. I'm going to pick my conceptual estimate. I'm going to leave that at built out again, and I'm going to finish. Okay, so I'm going to pick just a 100 by 100 again. High. I'll give it a floor and a roof. So there's my 100 by 100 square foot building again. I'll go look at those user-defined variables just to see. So here's the building classification, and you can see that the value is just set to 5, which is the hazard building right here. And then if I go look at those other two, I think it was lockers. So you can see those are now set to 1 because we don't have lockers in here. Where is that one? Here it is. They should be, or set to 0. They should be set to 0. And then that option for artwork is also set to 0. So this is just a quick example. So now if you look at my estimate view, just to show you really quick, you know, right now it's at 1,949,000 for just what I've drawn so far. I could also go here and select the core and shell. It's not going to change much because I didn't do anything in, you know, a whole lot. But I could, you know, apply it to that building, and it will change a little bit right now just based on the few things I've drawn. And that's because it's taking some of the cost out, some of those collections and cost items. But if I go back and look at these user-defined variables, they should be still the same. So building classification is still at 5. The lockers are still at 0, so on and so forth. And that's about it. I think I covered the basics of this. So it's a way to organize your buildings. This way we essentially have identified 20 different building types. These 10 buildings, which could either be built out or core and shell, and then as we progress, we might add some, you know, some of these buildings might split up, like for example, we might need to actually separate out a parking structure, and then we end up with a handful of, or probably about 2 handfuls of options that need to actually change, or variables that need to change, like the building structure, which could easily change. The roof type, those kinds of things. So that is about it. I think I can open it up for questions now if there are any questions.
Great. Thank you, Heather. We do have a few questions coming in. Everyone, please feel free to go ahead and just enter them in the chat, and we'll get to them as we go. As far as just Kraus-Anderson in general, how many team members do you have using Profiler there?
Right now, it's just me. We have, here at Kraus-Anderson, we use Citrix, so we're just starting to test Profiler in the Citrix environment. Right now, it's just a standalone license. And so once we get that working, then we will have this available to our pre-construction team. Mm-hmm. And that team has about 10 people. So we're pretty optimistic that it will get it worked out, hopefully within the next month.
Great. And then as far as the database, I know you have to have that built before you can even think about doing this workflow. How long would you say it took to get your database built and cleaned up?
Okay, that's a good question. It's kind of a labor of love, and it's a never-ending project. I'll just be honest with you. It's very easy to get the line items in because all you have to do, if you've got a database, is you export them to Excel, and you can copy and paste once you get the columns in the right format and the coding in the right places. You just copy and paste them in. So getting the line items in was very easy. But figuring out how to calculate the formulas, how to calculate the quantities, that's the challenging part. So each line item, because it has to, we wanted this to be a very dynamic program so that it wasn't very static. So if I did stretch things and move things and changed building types and did certain things just in the model itself, that it would change. So things like exit counts and stairs, which are dependent upon the size of the building, and we wanted it to be very dynamic. So that took a lot longer. I think it probably took, I don't know how many hours. If I put it into hours, it might have been 40 hours worth of work to create all the formulas for the line items, including the variables and the other formulas and stuff.
Yes. And do you think the labor of love with the database building will ever end, or do you see it as just a continual process of upkeep?
Well, if you're like most people in the construction industry who's sort of adopting a lean culture, it's a continuous improvement. And so, no, there's always room for improvement. We're always going to find something to make this better, to make it a little closer. What we want to do is get it as close to what the estimate should be. So there's always going to be something that we're going to look at and say, you know, we can get this quantity to be closer to what we would assume if we were manually doing this. It's not as much work though. Once you get the big part done, then it's just it's a little bit funner because you're getting to problem solve.
Exactly. And then as far as just this method in particular, I know that you just saw variables as a huge problem and a lot of time spent there. Was there something particular that drove you to create this method?
It was, yeah, because, well, we wanted, when we rolled this out to the pre-con team, I had talked to a few of our pre-con members about this and showed them. It was so overwhelming for people to see all these variables. And I just knew that if we rolled it out without a way to, make presumptions before even starting to model that, it was going to be harder to adopt. So by doing this, because so many of these things we can assume, we can make some assumptions on what these values should be. I mean, we can kind of say we know how much of these percentages of floor we want to assume. We don't need to make the end user go through and figure that out every single time they model. That's just, not needed. So this way, now they can start with a building type. It's a little closer to what they need it to be, and they don't have to think about it. So yeah, it was about the trainability and the traction.
Okay. So you're anticipating that this approach will increase the use of Profiler whenever you do kind of roll it out to the pre-con team?
I absolutely think it will, because it'll be closer to what they're anticipating for the end cost and quantities, and they won't have to think about it as much.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, I think that's about all the questions we have for today, so I'll go ahead and end this presentation. Heather, I want to thank you so much for showing this workflow and giving everyone some insight into how you're doing things. And we hope to see y'all all at our next webinar. Thank you, Heather.
Yep, thanks.